So there's just really, difficult, contradictory things happening among progressive communities here, in relation. So, I mean, I don't think that there's a lot of real thinking about anti-imperialism. Why that is central to any progressive social movement work you do here. Now, you can't do feminism without thinking about imperialism. You can't do worker organizing without thinking. I mean, you can't do any of those things without actually taking the fact of imperial war and what's going on in its name, which affects all of us, in very different ways, seriously. Probably I should just start with saying something about my own intellectual and political genealogy, which I think is really crucial in understanding the kinds of questions I'm asking and the kinds of analysis that I'm trying to get through, right? Okay. So I think that growing up in India and coming to the US via Nigeria, which is what I did. I taught high school in Nigeria before I came here as a student. Growing up in India, it was very clear to me that if I was interested in any kind of questions of freedom or liberation, I had to take on decolonization as a deep intellectual epistemological question, because even though I grew up as part of a post-independence generation, all we had at that time was formal decolonization, which meant we weren't necessarily thinking about all of the deep ways in which colonization actually affects a people beyond, beyond self-governance, right, at the state level. What are the ways in which people who are formerly colonized and who've been subjected to various forms of domination have to think about decolonization at psychic levels, at social levels, in terms of racialized gender ideologies, in terms of the knowledges being produced, which, the knowledges being produced, the kinds of things that are taught in the school system become very crucial in terms of how people can imagine themselves. So growing up there and experiencing also a different colonized culture, which was in Nigeria, where I taught high school and where I had to justify to myself teaching Keats and Shelley and Shakespeare to Nigerian students for whom this was a very far stretch. Not that it wasn't for me when I was in school in India, but I think the combination of those experiences really brought home the significance of thinking about history and specifically colonial legacies, okay, in any liberation project for me. So then I come to the US, and one of the things I have to do almost immediately is learn the script of race and racism in the United States. And this is a new script. It's not that I don't understand a little bit of it, because I've lived in Nigeria as an Indian in a black country with Europeans in very dominant role, even then. But, the script of American racism is very particular. And in order to understand that, you really have to, as somebody from the outside, as somebody from the South, it was very important that I actually teach myself about the counter narratives or the history from below of this country, in order to both understand how racial and economic domination worked and where I fit in as an immigrant and as a person from the South. And so that kind of thinking about colonial legacies then comes together with thinking about what those legacies mean in the context of a hegemonic culture in the North, and not any old culture, the United States. How do you keep in your mind, in your analysis, in the way you make sense of the world, how do you keep questions of the profound gendered structure of society together with colonial legacies, capitalist scripts, racialized ideologies, and nationalisms? How do you keep those things together and use that as a frame to understand what's going on? So a lot of my work then began by asking the question, so what am I reading in terms of feminist theory? You know, what is hegemonic feminist theory, however one wants to define that, teaching me? And what it was teaching me was that that there was a way in which the focus, a particular kind of focus on gender, as non-racialized, as non-classed, right, and as sometimes sort of non-racialized, non-classed, and also taken for granted as U.S. American. There was no space really for thinking about marginalized constituencies of women who, in my opinion, very often were poor, working class, of color in the North, and often peasant working class workers in the South, that there wasn't a space for understanding these communities of women as critical communities with agency, having their own understanding of how they are located in the situation they're in. That is, that they have an understanding and reading of power, right? Because what I started finding was that the kind of feminist theory or gender analysis that I was subjected to, or that I was exposed to, really ended up colonizing these groups of women in order to construct, you know, and as you know, some of my old work, in order to construct this this notion of the free, liberated Western feminist. Okay. Socialist feminists, while paying attention to questions of class and women workers, very often did not pay attention to questions of colonialism and race. So while, you know, there was a piece of it there for me that was important in the reading of capitalism and the understanding how capitalism and capitalist values become naturalized in the world we live in, and that they allow people actually with privileges to either construct people without those privileges as pure victims or as people deserving of charity, or as people who have no critical understanding of power and how to fight it. You know, that seemed to be what I was reading. So that's actually some of the ways in which I get to thinking about what it means to speak of global capitalism, corporate globalization right now, and of the possibility and the potential of transnational anti-capitalist feminist struggle, right? that's how I get to this place where I'm, you know, asking the questions of what is it, for instance, about how historical colonialisms, how do historical colonialisms construct themselves and their relations of rule on the basis of racialized gender? Okay, that becomes an important question. And how does that then get picked up in the decades following? And how do capitalist relations of rule, in fact, utilize those gendered and racialized colonial legacies in order to now once again create surplus labor, once again create third world poor women as the preferred workforce, and can we actually talk about anti-capitalist struggle without understanding the importance of race, gender, colonial legacies in that struggle? So that, to me, is a really crucial question. And so one way to think about it is, now, in the world that we live in now, how does the colonial traffic in the imperial, right? How do imperialist projects now, imperialism, it seems to me that imperialism, militarism, and globalization, corporate, capitalist, corporate global, economic globalization, are now hand in hand right now, right? So there's a lot of people who will talk about those three things as three different things, okay? But for me, first of all, we need to understand how those three systems, modes of operation, practices, right, interconnect and sustain each other, and how at the heart of some of those practices, right, are gendered and heteronormative sexual politics and ideologies, that cements. So the kind of imperialism and militarism we see now requires a sort of construction of masculinity. It requires thinking about exactly actually mobilizing the old colonial ideologies of, you know, white men rescuing brown women from brown men. It's a very old trope. It gets mobilized again, over and over. And that trope actually is very crucial in creating hegemonic consent. It's important to not disconnect, I guess, analysis of, historical analysis of racialized gender that, you know, we now have an incredible amount of literature on colonial legacies of racialized gender in different contexts in the world, you know, to not disconnect that work from the work that's happening now, which people would call anti-globalization work or anti-capitalist work, you know. So while on the one hand I think that the whole tradition of European Marxism and you know, you know, the left probably, I don't know enough about the left in Europe, but I know a little bit about the left in the US. I also know a little bit about the left in India, and that a lot of the sort of critiques of the left, both in India and in the US, have come from women within those struggles who have made it very clear that, in fact, the kind of way the revolutionary subject is defined, or even the reading of how power works, you know, is faulty because it is not gendered, right? So some of the more interesting, like, union work happening right now, I think in the US, is with the Service Industrial Employees Union, where they figured out that they can't not pay attention, right, to the fact that women are the dominant workers in certain industries, like the health and the service industries, one, and two, that immigrant labor is also fundamental in this country to certain industries. So you cannot then go in and organize women and immigrants on the same kind of platform, because their experiences, in fact, are not exactly the same. So it's interesting because that then, it's a very on-the-ground example of how the moment you start paying attention to questions of gender and race, right, your practical politics, right, have to change. And then if you pay attention to that, the practical politics, and theorize from there, right, then you have a way to intervene in the larger discourses of the left. One of the ways that capitalism in this country, at least, is naturalized or normalized, meaning people breathe the values that are created and in the air around them, and think that is what democracy is, rather than it's connected to an economic structure which has a particular value system attached to it, right? Part of the way that is done, I think, is by mystifying, right, how power functions, by not allowing, by making it invisible, by not allowing us to actually see it, and so there are false categories that get created, I think, as one way that kind of mystification works, right? So, yeah, I mean, to the extent that we allow, we allow ourselves to, in fact, think in some of those rather rigid categories of worker who is non-gendered, or a capitalist who's also non-gendered and non-racialized, not located in any place, placeless, right? Then we are actually keeping the whole system going. I mean, the way change occurs, I think, is if people are able to think very carefully in the place that they are in about what is happening in most detailed forms, what is happening to the community that they are a part of, and how is that connected to what's happening in the world. There are real continuities, I think, between how globalization and capitalism has worked for centuries now, in fact. Okay, so I don't think that there's been a marked break in that. I do think, though, that now, with the sort of almost monopoly of certain corporations and the power of transnational governance institutions like World Bank and IMF, which are again governed by very particular Western countries, that with that, and with the fact that the largest economies in the world are now corporate economies and not countries, not the economies of countries. So clearly there's been a major shift in terms of economic and therefore political power. So yes, there has been that shift. The effect, some people argue, I think, that nation states therefore have no role, or are much less important than corporations. I would say that nation states still continue to play a very significant role, usually as always as the mediating force between corporations and the way labor is organized in any country, really. So I think that in various parts of the South, free trade zones are only possible because the state, in fact, is making them possible. So without the state, there would be no free trade zones really possible. and the state provides a lot of the surveillance and policing mechanisms that are then required by corporations in order to engage in the level of exploitation that they engage in and the level of profit making that results from it, right? So yeah, I think that has changed. I think that with that level of corporatization, if you were thinking specifically of what's happening with women workers in factories and so on, people have talked about there being this incredible shift from privatized patriarchal relations within the family to what is referred to as public patriarchy. So the factory or the corporation becomes the patriarch who is taking care of the women who are employed. And is this better or worse? Well, some of the research shows that it's better in the sense that women have some income, and perhaps can therefore have a little bit of autonomy. On the other hand, is this liberation? No, because public patriarchs have similar paternalistic and controlling and surveillance relationships in place. I think what's interesting question then is in the shift from private or familial patriarchal structures to this kind of public, if you were to call it public, corporatized, I would say less public, more corporatized patriarchal structures, whether in fact that shift means that there is really an accelerated form of control that happens in the name of, young girls getting salaries, getting money, participating in beauty contests, all of the kinds of ideologies that then support the naturalization of capitalist culture, I think, right? And the consumerism that has to be present in order for capitalism to actually function well, right? And what's interesting to me is how it is that we, wherever we are located, very rarely think of ourselves, our roles as consumers, as being central to the way capitalism works. And here's another, gendered lens, which is how capitalism, how capitalists, corporate companies go after women as consumers. To be a consumer at the level of having access to lots of brands of things becomes a sign of liberation or freedom to choose, right? Versus any kind of understanding of what it means to live as an individual who can make choices about your own life on your own, which you cannot. You can choose among products. You cannot choose a lot of stuff about your life, really. So I think there's been an exacerbation of an acceleration of forms of exploitation and colonization, really, which are continuous with what used to. I mean, the kind of strategies that are used sometimes are, old strategies of containment, of harassment, of physical violence. I mean, the same sorts of things that, the British and the Spanish and everybody else used to subdue subject populations, except now it's happening in different sites. And we, because media is so corporate controlled, almost everywhere in the world, because of that, people don't get to actually see the connections between what is happening in terms of struggles and pushbacks that are happening by marginalized people all over the world, and people who are, in fact, maybe there are similar corporations that are the same, that are being fought back against. And yet, if you don't see it, then you don't connect the dots. So then it seems like these isolated struggles, that people in Mexico have, and people in India have, and people in Sri Lanka have, and it's really not, in fact, concerted or connected in any way. So I think some of the most interesting forms of resistance is the transnational connection that is happening among women workers, but also among women in sex work specifically, and prostitution that's happening transnationally, among women who are, one of the largest growth industries for third world women has been the maid industry, domestic workers who, from the Philippines and elsewhere, from Asia to the Middle East and to Europe and to the US as well. All of these conduits are now in place, right? And all of these border crossings, right? Which are very much, I think, a part of this particular stage of corporate globalization, and so certain bodies can cross under certain conditions, and it seems like this is freedom, that you're free to cross, right? Versus, well, you have to cross in order to sustain yourself and your family back home sometimes. I mean, I wanted to talk a little bit actually about something else which is interesting, which shows something different about what's happening now with corporate globalization. And that is the growth of the global prison industry. And it is a global prison industry. Through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the counterpart of structural adjustment in the South was privatization in the North, and specifically in the United States, right? And the same kind of economic restructuring has happened here as has happened there, except, again, for those, for the kind of I don't know, ideas about superpower and privilege and whatever to work. It is important that most people don't see that there has been real economic restructuring, which is totally similar to the South, because of course this again the trace of the colonial and the imperial. Well, over there all of these devastating things have happened, in Bolivia and all these places, but here it's just it's either bad luck that middle managers are losing their jobs, or a particularly retrograde company who is shutting up shop and moving somewhere else, but there has been a period of structural readjustment, that is economic restructuring, that has happened in this country, and it has the primary form it has taken is, of course, deregulation and privatization. And the growth of the global prison industry in that sense is very, very instructive, I think. At the time when the 80s and 90s in the US, when people were losing their jobs, there was all kinds of furor about economic depression, economic downsizing, all of those things. The prison industry was in an economic boom, exactly the same time. And in the 1990s, while the crime rate in the United States went down, right, the prison population doubled. And before, actually, it's interesting because, people now are talking about the privatization of prisons, which basically means the taking over of the prison system by private corporations, right? So for-profit corporations. And so there were actually no privately owned prisons in the United States before, I think, something like 1983. And now it's like a boom industry. It's huge. There are prototypes that are being exported of privatized prison systems, exported to other countries. So Mexico is one, and I think Malaysia was another. And now I'm going to talk specifically about the U.S. and what I see as the present condition here, which is that there's a real dovetailing between domestic and foreign policy of the Bush war state right now, right? So we have been for a long time creating both internal and external enemies, and interestingly enough, very often they look alike, right? The internal and the external enemies. And I think that right now corporate globalization, corporate rule in this country goes together with the militarization of everyday life, right? And of the imperial project outside, imperial wars outside. So private prisons become a part of the way corporate America specifically flourishes, and the way it ties into its larger imperial aspirations. There are levels of surveillance now in place everywhere, like that didn't used to be the case. So health services, state health services, hospitals, school systems, and welfare offices, all of those things are all under surveillance and sort of managed in terms of internal threats. So who is an internal threat becomes a very big question. Phones are being tapped, just stuff like that. Military recruiters, it's now okay for military recruiters to go into public school systems to recruit young people for the military. It is, and again, very gendered practice, right? Because it immediately constructs notions of what kind of masculinities are desired masculinities, right? And the military or the prison become options then for young men of color, young African American Latinos, okay? So there's some like ridiculous, incredible statistics, like 2/3 of African American men young men are either in prison, on parole, or in some way connected to the prison system. 2/3, 1/3 are in college, as compared to 1/3. So it's almost like there are things happening which are disappearing, entire generations of groups of people. And the same, there's a rise of private immigrant detention centers, privatized immigrant detention centers all along the California, Texas, Mexico border. Okay, and again, what do privatized detention centers do? They look to fill beds. So there's been an enormous, the recent shift has been in sort of just thinking about what prisons mean. There's been a recent shift in thinking about rehabilitation, right, as the object of going to prison, to basically criminalization, permanent criminalization, because the point is to have people in prisons, to like Marriott, to fill beds. And that's a very, and again, why is this relevant for feminist work? Well, because similar racialized and gendered ideologies are being mobilized, that were mobilized pre 9/11 and post 9/11 as well. And also there is, women are the fastest rising population in prisons. And now this is not just US, but this is globally. More women are arrested for drug arrests than men. And some of the research shows that it's in fact women who are carrying drugs across borders. Sometimes, like Jamaican, they call drug mules, Jamaican women, Mexican women, for whom this is the only form of income, who carry drugs either for their boyfriends or for somebody else in power across borders, who get caught and then get thrown in jail and then stay there for a very long time. So, and again, poor women from the South, usually. And that kind of, you see, because there's a continuity between the war on drugs and war on terror and all of those things, so it's logical that in fact these are the people who get caught in it. They are still the most marginalized, they're still the most, vulnerable in many ways. The southern states have the largest growing private prison industry in the country. And again, you can understand why. How is this connected? Because prison labor is cheap labor, or free labor sometimes, in fact. So you have private corporations, and you don't have any public control or state control or anything on it. And the prisoners are part of chain gangs, they're part of labor forces for huge numbers of corporations in the South. So there's a whole pool here of, it's continuity with slavery in many ways. There's even a place in North Carolina that used to be a plantation in the 1850s, right? Which had some of the largest number of slaves. Then you outlaw slavery, and supposedly it's done. It's now taken over by the Corrections Corporation of America and made into a private prison, which houses largely young African American men that have been shipped, outsourced from the north, from Connecticut. So here, a whole other, incarnation of labor patterns that have, very long history in this country, and are devastating for many communities of color. So, you asked me what were some of the more, from where I sit, some of the more interesting and important, really crucial struggles are struggles around the prison industrial complex in this country. This is where a lot of young people of color are involved, in fact. And it's interesting because it's not yet seen as part of the anti-globalization movement or struggle, where it seems to me that it's perfectly compatible and connected. This is the other thing about anti-capitalist struggle. I think that we need to widen the range of how we understand the profoundly devastating effects of capitalist exploitation. Because the surveillance industry and the criminalization industry is totally connected to the way labor is organized in this country, and to the way it's organized around the world. And the fact that different countries, and often authoritarian regimes in different countries, are now reproducing the same kinds of prison systems and privatizing prison systems in the same way, I think shows us that we're moving in this direction that is really, really dangerous. The organization that I work with, what they do is really try to prevent the private industries and the corporations from coming in and taking over a prison. So they work with the communities on the ground, work with legislators, put pressure on local, county, state governments to not allow this to happen. And it is really precisely in the South, because the South is such an important place in this country for prison privatization, So and we've been successful in a lot of different places. There was a coalition with a student group where students in different universities organized against sort of companies that were connected to the the Corrections Corporation, which is the largest prison privatizer in the world. So Sodexo, which provided a lot of the food services, which does actually provide food services, outsourcing of which all universities are doing. That's the corporatization of the university. They organized to boycott food services and Sodexo pulled out. So there have been coalitions among different groups in different sites to target particular corporations and the building of immigrant detention centers and of prisons, of private prisons. But I think that it has to do with still fighting at the state level, at the legislature level, at getting people to in fact see that the community does not want this entity to exist. Privatization threatens democracy. Where private good substitutes for the public good is a profound way in which corporatization and globalization is working now, and that if one doesn't fight it, if you do not in fact see that this is something that permeates everywhere, right? We'll lose the battle, because if we buy into the rhetoric of, well, you privatize something, then the competition increases the output and it's more efficient and all of that stuff, and you don't keep in mind that when you privatize something, then as a citizen you in fact have no rights in relation to what the private company is doing. So I mean, right now there's people are privatizing absolutely educational systems. There are health systems, medical systems, public parks, transportation services. All of which there are struggles. I mean, there are struggles in this country around all of that stuff. Pushing back that level of privatization, because it deeply threatens some kind of understanding that there has to be that democratic citizenship is about the ability to participate in decision making about your life and about having accountability between you as a citizen and your governance structure, whatever the governance structure is. And that is totally undercut by this form of privatization, which is, and people who are part of this move, which is again a central part of how corporatization works here. I think people who are part of that are in fact very aware of this and are very brilliant at coming up with language that shifts the terrain of struggle or discourse or even understanding to somewhere else. So, you don't talk about people losing rights. You talk about people getting more efficient services. You you don't talk about accountability. You don't talk about the fact that in privatized spaces, it's people who have wealth and money who have a say, and people who don't have wealth and money have no say, have none whatsoever. So your citizenship is determined by your wealth and your class privilege. It's not, just because you happen to live in something that calls itself a democracy. It's nothing to do with, what you, really the kind of rights you're afforded. And so if you don't take on privatization in a central way, I think it becomes, if you see it merely as like an economic solution or something to do with efficiency, rather than it erodes some very, very central kind of ways of thinking about the public good or about the public, public responsibility, public whatever, relationships, all of those things, it's really quite insidious, actually. I am not squeamish about militant tactics. So in other words, I don't think one can be a nice girl and make any revolutionary change. So I don't think that deliberate destruction or violence against someone else, is necessary in order to actually create militant tactics and get attention from the media, if that's part of what one is trying to do. I think that the Seattle demonstrations were really interesting because first of all, it was a coalition of like a zillion different sets of people and communities, and the fact that this happened and that the organizers were able to bring so many people together was amazing and crucial, because it was one of the first things that happened in the US, I think, after the 60s, honestly, that made people sit up and think, oh, well, there are enough people who are really thinking critically about what's going on and who are willing to take certain kinds of stance. So one of the effects of that, I think, if you were paying attention and if you cared about these things, one of the effects of that was to show people that in fact the state and the transnational institutions do not have that kind of absolute power necessarily, okay, in terms of people's hearts and minds. That power is not there. It was clear that dissent on a mass scale was possible. I think that was one of the most important things about Seattle. And maybe that is one of the most important things about those mass demonstrations. We're also struggling with the fact that the media is so corporatized. And so for information, you have to go to alternative media sources, which many of us go to, but everyone can't go to them. You have to have certain kinds of access in order to find alternative sources as well. But, I think in terms of the fact that we are working, you talked about the Swedish state, I would say the US state is like, the most depressing state that we've had in I don't know. And it's a very unabashedly imperial state right now. And whether the elections next year will change that, I don't know. I don't think so. I think the same kinds of policies will continue, whether I think there will be a difference if there are Democrats in power. I think one of the differences will be that perhaps the religious right, you know, will not be as centrally involved in governance as it is now, which is another whole. And you know, this is the other way in which what the U.S. state has done recently is all the fatherhood initiatives and faith-based initiatives. That's a very important place to look at how normative heterosexuality is being rethreaded and recast in popular culture. Okay, that is just a perfect place to look at it. Again, the don't ask, don't tell, gays in the military, the whole debate around that is another place to look at how heterosexualization is a very important part of the state apparatus, especially states that are corporatized and imperial states. You know, those are part of the ruling practices. You have to see it. You have to pay attention to the connections between all of them. Anyway, that's an aside. So I think that with this state, I mean, I don't know that I can talk about what would be successful, but I think that there are struggles and there are people in different places that are coming up with alternative economic arrangements, or a different kind of basis of subsistence in the north, you know, and I think that those everyday practices, to me, are as important to pay attention to and to be clear about. There's something called community supported agriculture, right? Which is farmers who farm on the basis of support from an entire community that commits to subsidizing the farming, small farmers, right? And buying the product, whatever the product is, whether it's huge or little. Okay, so that's community supported agriculture. It's a very small thing, but it pushes back against agribusiness. It pushes back against certain kinds of ways in which you know, the world we live in is totally governed by certain kind of corporatized institutions. So I think that everyday practices or certain kinds of alternative institution building within various communities is very crucial. And to go to that point I made about toxic dumping, right? One of the points I was trying to make is that some of the struggles that poor women have been involved in all over the world have to do with their own neighborhoods and communities. So when it is a struggle that affects an entire neighborhood, it is always women who are in the leadership. And you can look all over Latin America, you can look in the US, lots of other places, right? And so one of the struggles in this country, which has been really led by poor women of color in inner city areas, and this is true even of Syracuse, which is, you know, down the street from us where I teach, a struggle against environmental pollution, right? Where corporations, and again privatized corporations, come into what is seen as an economically devastated area. And usually those are inner city areas or even rural areas which are seen as economically devastated. So no economic, no possibility of anything else. And also the assumption being that if there's economic devastation, then there is no political power among the people in that context. So then the corporations can basically make that area into a toxic dump. Okay, and so some of the struggles, you know, which of course women have said no to in those communities. And so some of the most urgent but also successful struggles against what is called environmental racism, you know, has been by these poor women of color on the basis of, the devastation of their communities due to toxic dumps. And they have managed to, in some cases, get corporations to move, to take it out of there. In Syracuse, there's this whole struggle going on around Onondaga Lake, which is polluted. And so there's a struggle about who can come in and sort of have access to this, and what will it do to the communities that live, in that area. And they happen to be poor black communities. It was also because of industry that now has fled. Actually, I'm trying to think. I think it's Lockheed Martin, in fact, which is one of the largest military defense contractors, that has been established in Syracuse for a long time. So it's a very, see, again, it's so interesting, all those connections, between the military and militarization and the effects of this is another form of thinking about militarization, I think, is in all of the different industries that are connected to the making of a highly militarized society, one where it is assumed that security is the only way to have security is through military and policing. Since I came to this country since the 80s, I have never thought that I have really lived in a democratic society or democratic culture. I think that there are certain formal mechanisms of democracy that work in this country and that are protected in this country, which are very important, which are not available in some other parts of the world. But I think that there is also, I'll give you an example. I remember listening to a talk by the Latin American intellectual Ariel Dorfman, and he talked about how people are always, talking about totalitarian regimes in Latin America, and how, in the US, people have freedom of speech, and how there's no censorship, and how authoritarian regimes exercise serious censorship on what people can say and so on. And he said, what had always interested him was that in this country is the highest level of self-censorship that he's ever experienced. So even people don't even allow themselves to articulate something because it has been stopped somewhere else, right? Which is a very interesting comment, about what is democratic culture if, in fact, there's a belief that there's freedom of assembly, speech, and so on, and yet there are certain things that, because they are not in the landscape that you grew up in, you can't even imagine or speak it or fight it, whereas oftentimes in authoritarian regimes, the power is very blunt and clear. I mean, to me, pedagogically, one of the things that has happened is that the fact that in the US now, the exercise of power is so raw around us, has meant actually that it's possible to, in fact, talk about US culpability, accountability, and all of these things, where before, it worked in similar ways, but it wasn't as explicit, So the imperial projects are right out there. And so now you can actually say, so is it possible to talk about the US as a democratic state just internally, if it is actually an imperial state externally? Do you not have to bring those two together? I mean, it's not possible to just say, okay, democracy exists here, and you're bringing democracy elsewhere. You cannot bring democracy to anybody, people, you can't gift a group of people with democracy or freedom. Freedom can't be a gift. People struggle for it on their own. You know, you win it, you achieve it. You can't be given it. It doesn't, that's not, I mean, if you take, especially if you take, you know, some of the things I said earlier about decolonization seriously, you know, just the decolonization, just a colonizing power moving out of a country does not mean that the country is free in terms of people, in terms of how people think, in terms of how people feel, or what they are able to imagine for themselves. What they often put in place is a neo-colonial regime, which is, of course, what many of our experiences have been, which are always very nationalist and masculinist at the same time. We need to make the distinction between the people of a country and the government of a country, because the government many times does not represent the interests of the people at all, and it's only representing its own interests. I don't know, I guess I think that there are many large struggles ahead of us, and I think that, you know, the way to think about winning struggles is to be clear that these struggles are actually happening around the world, in various places around the world, and that, you know, history really teaches us that profound changes are possible, I think, if people respond and if people resist. I mean, I do believe in revolution. What that means in different sites and in different contexts, I think one would have to really look at and think about carefully, because it may not look the same and it may not be the same. So the Zapatista movement is a revolution, but will we be able to reproduce the Zapatista movement in the US? I don't think so at all. Indigenous communities in the US have, you know, a very clear critique of colonization and genocide by the US state, historically, and a claim for sovereignty, right? But it's also the case that they are working within the context of a US national landscape, which is very corporate and consumer oriented, right? So the struggles and the models that indigenous communities come up with in the US actually are you know, different, and the tactics are different. The Mohawk struggle, I mean, people had militant armed struggle in various places in Canada and the US and so on. It hasn't happened in a long time in the US. But it's a very different history of struggle than, for instance, the struggle for civil rights in this country, where the struggle for civil rights was a struggle to become part of a polity that was that treated black people as less than equal, right? So, but Native Americans, American Indians struggle is not always, and in fact, most of the nations I know and the people I know who are writing within this, it's not about civil rights, because they reject the US as the nation that they want to belong to. You know, so they're very different genealogies of struggle and very different kind of histories and tactics that people end up following. My sense is that all of these things are really crucial and really important. And no one thing is going to get us what we want. And I really, I think it's important to always look at a situation carefully, look at the history of the situation, look at the relationships within that context, and ask the question of, so what is it, what are the stories that I have been told about this? And how have the stories left out, you know, particular things that I need to know in order to really understand and figure out what form of resistance will work. You know, I think that in my context as a teacher, I have found that some of the most radical activity that I can engage in is to provide students with alternative narratives and histories to the ones that they take for granted. And that shakes up the paradigm that has been normalized. Even right now, you know, to think about war and to think about the stories that people have about men in leadership in war, and to raise questions about, you know, where are the women and what positions do they occupy, which women occupy what positions, how does the story that you know actually account for their lives, and does the story you know allow them any agency at all, and why not? Should they not be allowed agency, right? So in the same way as, you know, you have the third world woman as victim, you ask the same kind of question, you turn it on its head and say, so if you didn't think about women workers in Sri Lanka or India or anywhere as victims, but you began from the place that they sit and what they see, how they organize, how they analyze what's happening to them, right? And then use that as a way to complicate the narrative that you have taken for granted always, you know? Then what does that say to you about what a just society looks like, or what kind of values you have about human life, you know? Is one more valuable than the other? Those kinds of questions, I think, you know, the ethical questions then become possible. I think for me, one of the effects of the naturalization of certain capitalist values, and by that I mean competitiveness, the assumption that success means wealth, that wealth and success are just, that's it. That somebody, that being able to be a good consumer is a major value, that ownership is not even questioned. Those kinds of things that become just totally naturalized, which undermine any kind of notion of interdependency, collaboration, inequality, or the connection between privilege and domination. That connection gets severed. I mean, that is one way in which capitalism is naturalized, is that people stop seeing that the fact that they are rich has something to do with the fact that huge numbers of people are poor. You just, that's it, you know. But if you start from the other place, right? You start from the place of people who are actually fighting those forms of domination, right? And who are therefore, you know, they can't afford not to see what's going on because they need to get out of that situation real quick. You know, but you start from that place, and then you look up the power structure and you start posing questions about what the cost of privilege is, right? And are you willing to live with that cost? You know, I think that ends up actually really getting people, you know, when we're successful at that really gets people to perhaps make some different choices about their own lives and what they will do with it. Because I think part of the way privilege works, I mean, privilege really works by reproducing itself. It constantly reproduces itself. So you got to interrupt that, you know. And I think so counter narratives. I think that, I don't know, I think resistance needs to work at all kinds of different levels. And the best resistance is that which begins in the place that you're at. And this is like a motto of all organizers. You begin where you are. And you look around you, and who's around you, and who are the people you're in touch with, and what are their lives like, and what would it take? Is that the group that you're working with? Then what does it take for this particular group of people to come to some collective understanding, right, of the conditions of their lives and how the conditions of their lives are connected to the conditions of lives of people in different places in the world, you know. And I think that that's the best way that people organize. Organizers who are successful are really able to do that, you know, to really begin where they are. And then it is very much the history of labor in this country is very much the history of race and gender. Okay, they go like this. And I think that's true anywhere. But it's fascinating to look at it in this country because particular groups of women from different communities, you know, have historically in this country occupied different parts of the labor market, and they've been segmented, saturated in those places. And I think that it's important to understand how race and gender are integrally connected to the history of capitalism and labor and the building of the United States as a nation. Okay, so the US becomes a nation through those three interconnected histories. Okay, so particular groups of people get exploited and super exploited in certain ways, and that's totally connected to a whole other set of people who are exploited in a whole other different way, right? And so, you know, so then you have, you still have sweatshop labor, you still have women in Silicon Valley, you still have the preponderance of homework, which is, or piecework, which is a huge, huge part of what is happening with immigrant labor, specifically women workers, immigrant women in the US. And the way that level of super exploitation works, I think, is through the mobilizing of gendered and racialized ideologies, right? And so that's where I think an anti-capitalist analysis or a socialist or a Marxist analysis that doesn't pay attention to how race and gender are mobilized in the service of profit, right, fail to actually both understand what's going on, right, and also find a way to actually organize across those boundaries, you know. In the early 20th century in this country, the Communist Party actually was successful, was one of the few places, few groups that were successful in organizing black and white workers together in the shipbuilding industry, I think. So, but again, you know what happened to the Communist Party. So it has always, so there's always been, I think, a lot at stake in workers from different racialized and gendered groups and identities finding ways to work together and organize together. That has been always, because they've always been separated by the way capital has functioned, you know. And so I think there's no way to really understand, I don't know how you can even talk about any form of a proletariat without racing and gendering it right now, and also making it geographically, understanding it geographically in terms of where people are located and how they're connected to the larger systems, you know. So I think, this is very much a reality of what is happening right now. It's incredible, actually. So you think that, at least here, that we live in a culture where people are attentive to and are trying to not be racist and not be whatever, but all you have to do is to look at all these patterns and groups of people concentrated in all these different places to know that this is not. What's amazing to me is that the working conditions, there aren't that many differences, you know, when you go to when you look at working conditions in the North and the South for particular groups of women workers who are seen as the most expendable and exploitable labor. So, which makes sense, because this is where the most amount of profit can be extracted, and the assumption being that these are the most powerless people. So if they're powerless, then they can't challenge us. And therefore, I think that some of the most important struggles are transnationally, women worker struggles across borders. If I live here, and if I've lived here for this long, it is really my responsibility to engage in what is happening here, which has devastating effects for everyone around the world. I mean, this is the weird thing about living here. It's both the most hopelessly depressing thing, I mean, because things are happening around you that are just phenomenally oppressive. And it is also one of the most urgent and important things to be living here now, because there's so much work to be done here, and you can't not do the work. I may feel like an outsider, and I am an outsider, but I'm still on the inside, in the sense that there is a certain amount of power I can have, and there are privileges I have. And so then the question becomes, so what am I doing with my power and my privileges? And there are, so that, and to me that's the question people who live here need to ask, is what are the privileges you have, right? And what are you doing with those privileges? Not just for yourself, because that's easy. Everybody can do it for themselves. But what are you doing for what's happening in the world, and for what the US is doing in the world, really?